Welcome all to our community lunch. Remember, everybody is welcome to eat during this, right? This is our noon hour, and we bring a guest every week. And of course, we're returning to our story series with Dr. Clayton from Air University. And Doc, you're taking over a new position. Is
Yes,
that something you're able to talk about?
I think I am now. Up until last night, we weren't sure until it was blessed by the Air University commander. And so they're consolidating a couple organizations that do teaching and learning, innovation kind of institute and leadership concepts overall, merging it into kind of a new organization. I think it's going to be called Vector Alliance, which will be the hub for Air University's all faculty development, immersive learning, learning experience design, convocations for faculty and development, those types of things. And then my role, my new job description will be Chief Experiential Learning and AI for AU to bring everybody kind of together. We're going to be doing digital badging of immersive learning courses, workshops and stuff. And we're going to be working the next couple of days building out our new facility that's inside the Air University Library, which is the second largest library in the Department of Defense. Sits at Maxwell Air University. So interesting. It's all kind of happening fast, and I wasn't sure if there was going to be funding, and all of a sudden I get a phone call this morning that there's funding that we need to build out your new space. That used to be a bunch of press people that did publications for the Air University, and they're all gone because that contract's gone away. It's a bunch of cube farms. It's now going to be turned into what we kind of want it to be, but it perfectly lines up with the things that they're doing, the stuff that we worked on, JJ, for how many years together about, right, teaching and helping faculty to learn how to bring in immersive learning into an organization, into a curriculum, or to whatever, to experiences, whether it's for faculty or students, right, and how to look at this differently. So everything that we JJ, you've talked to several of our commanders. You've met with them and stuff here, whether it was our officer training school and squadron officer school or LDC. You've developed our faculty in different ways. You've talked to the commanders about how they should look at immersive learning in different ways, right? Over the years, sometimes the Air Force, it takes a little while for them to catch on and get there. And we finally have, I think, gotten there, because I've been talking to AU about we need a immersive learning, and I'll call it a simulation center at Air University. So it's not just one college doing the thing and this college is doing something else, right? In a lab. So we can't call it a center because by law and Congress, we can't call it a center. So it's going to be called an alliance or a hub that we run now for Air University and stuff. So yeah, super exciting.
Well, and Andy, I'll tell you, of all the organizations that you and I have seen collaborating through the government together, I have to say that the Air Force, I think, has consistently been a leader in adopting these technologies, right? And
Yes.
so to watch it mature to the place where they're going to have a chief experience officer, my
Yep.
brother, that
And
tells me that the evolution is that we're getting really close to crossing the chasm, right?
yes. Yep.
Um,
Yes.
and so super exciting, ultimately, as we're talking about story and how it applies to experience design, right?
Yes.
And once we get to immersion, we're really talking about how do we bring that person inside the story. And so moving from a watcher into a first person position where it has choice and agency, how do we write story for that? How to create story for that? And today we're going to talk about how do we actually influence the internal journey or flow, right,
Yes.
of the participant, right? And for me, I've always looked at flow from a director point of view, from a young theater director's point of view, right? You want to get the audience emotionally involved in the story where they're not being kicked out of it, right? And that emotion and that empathy is like an airplane taking off, right? And when you have an intellectual disruption, the plane has to start again,
Yeah.
right? So, flow for me is the consistency of experience, right? That maintains the story. And then by maintaining the story, you're maintaining investment, right?
Yeah.
you're investing in that experience, you're investing in the character, the objectives, the win, the losses, right?
Yes.
So, Andy, give us your take on flow, and help us understand the importance of it.
Yeah, JJ, I'm so glad you brought up story, and so I'll give you that an educational or an education framework of flow because it's very similar because the plane is still taking off. But if you look at like a vertical axis and a horizontal axis in flow in education, the vertical axis is the challenge that you're giving to the student in the experience, right? Whatever that challenge is. The horizontal axis is the skill that the student brings to the table, right? And so if there's low skill and high challenge, right, that student's going to have anxiety, right, in the experience, right? And so that's not good. If the student has a lot of skill, but the challenge is really easy, they're bored, right? But what you're talking about is that plane, or the airplane, that there's this vertical line that's going through there that is optimal. Adjust the right amount of skill the student has, and you give them the challenge that meets their skill, and that puts them in this optimal flow, which we call, right, because we're trying to create optimal sustainment of the optimal learning experience when we talk about education. And that comes from considering and understanding the importance of the student's affective state of mind, right? And this is why they call it the affective state or state of flow. So flow is denominated by the affective state of mind. So this is what's really interesting. So how do you do that? So often most people in education will talk about like you got to make the challenge, just enough challenging, but they have the right skill. Let's say you're a maintenance officer and you're turning the wrench on the aircraft, right? But I've never held a wrench before. And I go out there and right, this is, I might have a little bit of anxiety. But when we move into immersive learning and we get into the virtual spaces, right, this is where I think your story part comes into, and a great example is um, story can help keep that student in that affective state of mind to help balance that challenge to skill. So that's an element that you can bring in to help with flow theory. Let me give you a different example, and a totally different example that will probably hopefully help. Anybody ever go roller skating when you grew up? Right, and you go roller skating. You ever see those people that are roller skating really close together and they're in sync, right? And they're doing the leg thing and stuff like that, and there's a bunch of them together, right?
Yep.
Right. It's called shuffle skating, right? And if you ever go watch a YouTube video of shuffle skating and turn the sound off and just watch them. And because when you type in shuffle skating, you'll see these videos of like 4 or 5 people skating together around, and they're all in sync, right? So they have some skill, and there's a challenge not to knock each other over and to stay in sync. But when the music's turned off, you're like, it just seems weird, right? Because they're doing that. But when you turn the music back on, the music has a beat to it, right? That beat and that music is immersion. It's a stimuli that helps with the challenge, right, of the skill that they have, right? So you can look at music as the way to help with flow. Just like JJ just mentioned, when we're in VR, the use of story, keeping the story, right, helps with that affective state of mind. So it helps close the gap between the challenge and the skill. So maybe there is a little bit of anxiety, right, within the challenge because I don't have enough skill. But if I bring in something else like an immersive story, like spatial storytelling, like JJ is talking about, the story might help take down some of that anxiety. It helps with the affective state of mind. In education, we always just talk about like, well, you got to reduce the challenge, or you got to like make sure they have the right skill before you make them go on to the next challenge. And that's fine in education because that's an instructional design approach. But in learning experience design, which what JJ's talking about, story, right? When we understand story, if we understand the importance of story, it actually tells us, it helps with a student's affective state of mind, which is what is called flow. That story helps them stay in flow. So maybe there is a little bit of challenge in there. Maybe they don't have enough skill yet in the VR thing, but the storyline and other immersion, other elements of immersion can come in. Music, spatial sound, right? All these things, the way things look in VR. But the story, since that's what we've been talking about, story is a great way to keep that person in what we call an affective state of mind, right? So I love how you talk about the airplane in that story, and if it gets impeded, it takes them off because it takes them out of that affective state of mind, right? And so maybe I need it to be a little bit challenging. Maybe they don't have the skill yet when we go in VR, but maybe I can use some other elements of immersive design like story, right, to keep that affective state of mind right in that right mindset to help them move through the experience to keep them in that state of flow.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it makes me think of many ways, other ways to create flow. I mean, you just talked about music generating flow and story generating flow. Once you've built relationships, right? And you care about a character,
Mm.
I mean that generates deeper connectivity,
Oh,
right?
yeah. Yes.
And then it's harder to break the flow, right?
Yes.
Um, and we know that competition can induce flow,
Yes. Yep.
right? Because the deeper we can get somebody to pursue a purpose,
Oh,
right? Once they adopt purpose, then the
yes.
strength of the flow is inherent. And once they care about somebody, and if they're potentially fighting for that person, now
Yep.
we've got empathy inside of that flow, right?
And JJ, if you take it to like on the Air Force side, right? A lot of our technical schools, maintenance training, pilot training, right? We have all these simulations for our students. The Air Force started with pilot training next, putting pilots into VR simulations, and then the Air Force said, "Let's do that with our maintenance course." So they took the maintenance course and moved it into a lot of VR stuff. And this is actually one of the first students. And it's been a while, JJ. It's been a while since you, Colonel Taylor, way back one of my first VR electives that you were a guest in. Nancy Taylor was one of our students, and she wrote her paper on flow theory and flow learning experience design.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
yep, and we
Did she
look and we
present
had the
it
data.
at did she present that at
Yes,
ITSEC?
yes, and she printed at ITSEC, and because we
Yep.
actually had data from the maintenance training program, and we had feedback from the students, and I'll give you an example of one, and it's this purpose part. So at Maintenance Training X, the students no longer had a lot of face-to-face time with their instructors or other students. They were using iPads for with augmented reality. They were going into VR and doing VR training instead of doing it hands-on in the way they used to do the maintenance course. And then so the students got feedback, and we broke it down, and we look under flow theory and looked at the analysis of the feedback from the students. For example, AR videos. One of the students said, "I feel like videos in the AR program did not prepare me for how the hands-on task would be, nor did I understand the why. Why do I do it this way?" Right? And so, and there's several students in their feedback said, it didn't explain why this was the way it needed to be done. Right? They just put in the challenge, and the students had some skill, whether it was in AR or VR, but the student didn't have any state of real flow when they were in these VR simulations. So they could go do it, but when they come out, and this is where self-efficacy comes in, right? When you're looking at immersive learning, is that you have to understand self-efficacy, and that comes from the affective state of mind. And in these VR simulations, they could go in and do it, but then the students didn't know why. There was no explanation, there was no story, there was no purpose, or they didn't understand the purpose because they were just going in to do the task in VR. They had less contact with instructors to understand why you're going through this, less contact with students, right? So, and all that played into this overall concept of really flow for the maintenance course, not just the VR experience, but the flow of the whole course. Because you took away connections, we call this transactional distance theory, losing connections with people and instructors and peers, and the course becomes transactional. There's no storyline, there's no purpose, there's no why to what I'm doing, right? And so I love this purpose that you bring up connects with the affective state of mind.
You know, you what you bring up reminds me. I got to visit the Marshall Center a very long time ago, and the United States trains people from leadership of all different countries around the world. They're really building friendships and back channels between these countries. But they were doing 2 days of simulation at the end of it, and I was there to look at it and to say, how do you make this more real? Well, for them, because they're decision makers, they're not on the ground with flares going over their heads and explosions. How do we make this simulation real?
Mm.
And part of what it was they were shoving 2 days of simulation that's really 2 months of simulation into 2 days, right? And really what they want you to do is read the story and bubble in A, B, C, or D. Wow,
Mm.
man, the brain has not taken on the story in any way, right?
Yep.
So when you look at virtual experiences that do something like a Star Trek where you're starting to phase out to a new place, right? The brain needs those transitions to help
Yes.
it adopt the story. And that is part of getting people into the flow, right?
Yes.
So
Yes.
there is an entry point into flow that we should talk about. And we started that on our first day in foundations. The people need to know who they are, where they are, what they are doing, right?
Yes. Yep.
Then they need to discover the why because they have to care about it. If they don't discover the why, they don't care,
Yes. Yes.
right?
Ugh,
And flow and empathy are the power of this thing.
yes. Yep. Ugh, and it ties into other models that we've talked about, like Camel, the cognitive affective model for immersive learning, right? And that model tells you there's a cognitive side to like immersive learning, but there's also an affective side. And that affective side is influenced by immersion and presence, which comes from what you're talking about, JJ, right? Story, right? They have to know who, what, where, and right, and why, right? To be able to be for the affective side to connect with them, to have a sense of presence that they're part of this storyline, this
Yep.
experience that comes from immersion. And in this case, story is our form of immersion, right? So it's
Yeah.
such a connection to these
Well,
concepts.
it's funny. What we suggested at the Marshall Center is they had 3 months of training before they did this simulation, right? And then they were they were divided into groups, and they each represented one of four different countries that were going through a terrorism event. But first, the groups had to get together like a UN and make all the policy decisions that they would abide by if the terrorist event happened, right? Then they need to do some testing, and then they actually ran as if the terrorist event was happening, and they had to communicate to each other, right, and figure things out. But it was all done bubbling. I'm like, no, man, if we're gonna do this, let's do this, right?
Yes.
Like get
Yes.
them on a phone call. They've got to convince somebody to do something. The other person has their own agenda and their own time limitations, right? In 15 minutes, something else is going to happen. Once you create opposing tasks, right? And you give somebody a time element, right? A time limitation builds pressure,
Yes.
right? And that pressure helps also the intensity of the flow, the emotional investment into the flow.
So JJ, we did my pitch yesterday to the Air Education Training Command Commander, 3-star General Robinson yesterday with 6 other teams from the Air Force to pitch our immersive ideas for a gap in training for the Air Force. And we pitched ours, and um, he asked, because ours is, looking at these kind of what we call physical leadership reaction courses. A team is at point A and they're all trying to move to point B, and there's a wall and a rope, or there's a moat of water and they got to carry a dummy, and it's physical, and you have
Yep.
15 minutes to do it. That's been the staple of the leadership assessment experiential learning thing that every officer and enlisted person has done in the Air Force for the past 60 years in the Air Force, right? And so, but if you were to move that into an immersive space, right, which is what we were starting to design, he actually asked a question after I pitched it. He's like, but there's still that physical presence or physical part of the Project X is what it's called, leadership reaction course. How are you going to replicate that in your immersive VR spaces? I told him, I said, General Robinson, I said, there's other ways in which we can look at stress inoculation, or look at how immersion and presence can develop this type of what you're asking for stress. And I told him time. I said, and so in time in the physical one, it's just 15 minutes. You guys have 15 minutes. That's their time. But in a VR space, so what if you're in this forward operating base and there's a brush fire around the base, and the brush fire is getting closer and closer, right? And you're trying to achieve your objective or contested objectives with you and your teammates, right? But time is being physically represented in a different way, which requires that. So it doesn't have to be the physical stress, it's other or immersive stress, if you will. And that was just one example, right, where we can look at time in immersive spaces much differently. And that adds to this, it adds to the story of what they were doing. You're at forward operating base, and I've had several students in the course, JJ. I'm asking them to write storylines, right? Because we're going to take these storylines if we get accepted by General Robinson for our proposal, and we'll be working with the university out on the West Coast that will build kind of this a storyline. You're a forward operating base team with 4 or 5
Yep.
people, right? And you're on the moon in a biosphere, right? And there's a meteor coming, right? That's going to hit the, and you've got to turn on the laser defense system, but if you use all the energy to do that, you're not going to have energy to keep the medical facilities on, which have all these new alien life forms that you found that you're trying to protect, right? It's right, and we're just creating the initial storyline that when we go, if we get picked, working with the developers out at Arizona State University, right? What is the storyline that we're coming into? Why are they doing this? Who are you? What's your objective? And why are you this team on this biosphere on the moon type thing, right? And stuff like that. So we're just developing the initial storyline so we can talk to the developers and not to take Project X, the physical thing, and just build it in VR, because that wouldn't work because there's no story to it. In the immersive space, I need a storyline, right, kind of thing and stuff, and I can find the stressors in different ways that you're talking about. So we just went through this essay. He asked that exact question about the physical, like how does that physically look stress-wise in an immersive space? And you mentioned time, and there's all kinds of other design elements. Contested resources, right? If I have enough energy to either power the laser defense system or enough
Yep.
power to keep the medical facility lights on, or I can kind of do a little bit of both, but I'm going to offset meeting the objective of saving these animals that we've, as we're all biologists on this moon-based thing, or saving it from, the laser defense system being turned on, right? So we all have different objectives, but the overall objective is what? And then, and then the contested resources, not enough energy to do both. So what are
Dude,
we going to?
I love it when they've got to win in the conversation, right? I mean, I
Yes,
put two people in a nuclear silo. They both have keys. One of them says, we've got to turn the keys. The other one
exactly.
says, I can't do this. Let's give
Yep.
them 2 minutes in a conversation to make their points,
And
right?
that's really and so, oh my gosh, JJ, right? So, because if you take this Project X physical leadership reaction course, and this is what in the research I've been looking at, right? We call this victory by design. There's
Okay.
always you win. It's a task. You get from point A to point B, right? And that's it. And how do we assess how immersive it was or how people do versus the ambiguity of an immersive experience? Because it's the conversation. So we create a story that puts them into the experience to work on these conversations. So now I can look at their competencies, decision making, accountability, resource management, versus what we have been doing for 6 years, a task. The task is designed that you either complete it or don't complete it. Victory by design, right? And
We
then I
call it
assess.
happy path learning, right?
Right.
Happy
Yeah.
path learning because there's
Exactly.
never a bad outcome, right? And what
Exactly.
we're finding is, dude, please invite your people to make mistakes now,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because there's brilliance inside of some of those mistakes. There's personal insights, and
Yep.
so yeah, man, I am.
And you can't do that kind of storyline in a lot of physical places because that's difficult to do because then that becomes a lot more role playing and things like that. It's hard to do. But in immersive VR space, I can create all kinds of stories and I can take you to all kinds of places and spaces and put you into this is who you're going to be, this is what you're going to do, this is why you're going to do it, and have a story with all kinds of immersive design elements that allow you to do that, which you can't do in the physical space. That's the
And you can replicate it a million times. You can make it
Yep.
accessible anywhere on the planet. You can personalize it for each learner. You can data
Yes.
collect out of all of it, right? So that, I mean, we're talking massive capabilities once you scale to that immersive place. Meanwhile, you're not replacing the live training moment, right?
Exactly. Yep.
You
Yep.
might be able to replicate it through capturing it with 360 and things like that, but
Yep.
you're adding shades of gray of learning where you can focus on intellectual, you can focus on situational,
Yes.
emotional, mental, like because each one of these are learning slivers.
Yes. Yeah, and that's what in my presentation was like, this is not to replace the physical leadership reaction course, it's to complement it. Maybe they still kind of need that right now because the Air Force's mindset is now the whole term now in the Air Force and the military is lethal. New leadership in the White House and the Secretary of Defense, right? It's all lethal, right? And that means physical. That's why you see the Secretary of Defense doing PT with like Army Rangers and stuff like that because he's trying to show like we're gonna be more lethal. So that's the physical side. Okay, so you still need the physical part of the military, but how am I going to capture and create experiences when we're going to have conversations between leaders and leaders about like we're not going to be able to save everybody when we're deploying people to Guam to go fight right in the South China Sea with China, and we know when 6 airplanes take off, only 2 of them are going to come back, which we've never had that for the last 100 years because we've always had air security and things like that, and it's not going to be the case. So how do commanders stuff deal with this type of ambiguity and risk? You can't replicate that now in the physical. So I can replicate giving you physical tasks and right and great right and getting over that stress and things like that. You're scared of heights or whatever. But how do you get people to work together to see how they're going to communicate and work with each other? Because if you complete that physical reaction course task, Doesn't mean you guys were good leaders, just mean you guys had enough physically strong people to get from point A to point B, right?
That's
And
right.
so
That's right. Because synthesis of ideas and problem solving, right, is because what's the saying, right? A good plan lasts until a point of contact, right?
yes,
And
exactly.
then everybody has to be a dynamic thinker. I'm
Yes.
really curious as to what we've got a couple people here that I want to get any thoughts that are boiling around in their head. So now that Aaron Collegeman has food in his mouth, let's ask him what he thinks. No, he's eating. Warren, we're going to go to you first, brother. And I just wonder what thoughts has this brought up for you?
Well, first of all, coping with story is something that I've been uh, pursuing for a long time. And one of the shticks that I have with my own students is talking about not story but narrative as the most powerful tool in the historian's toolkit. And what that means, and plot and narrative helps here. In terms of one of the central challenges in the study of history and learning from history is to understand how events come about and what are the multiple variant influences on events. Now, to many students, the study of history is just the study of autonomous events, dates, people, places. But it's the connections that they miss. And the point and in talking about narrative, um, I use the term contingency very often, and so I have a question for y'all. This is very stimulating conversation, by the way, but the contingency is the connectedness between events and developments. And a story is a contingent series of events. That's a narrative.
Okay.
And this comes into play in teaching, and some of the feedback, as I stress this more and more in teaching, some of the feedback I get from students is very revealing. One comment on a evaluation from last spring was, "Dr. Hofster tells good stories," and I took that as a very high compliment because of the engagement that story creates. So in talking about flow, a question I have, talking about flow, is there a connection between flow and contingency? In other words, in describing contingency, in uh, tracing the tissue of connectedness between people and events and places, is that comparable to what you've been describing as flow in story?
Doc?
Um, I totally believe so. Like connection between events is if I get that one more on that definition for I want to hear that one more time that definition, so I want to make sure I make the connection here of how you use that term, uh, the connection.
Contingent events are
Yeah.
events that one influences the other in time.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's cause and effect is what I'm
Yeah.
hearing, right?
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah,
so cause and effect
that's a legitimate way of looking at it.
so cause and effect is absolutely essential in flow, right?
Yeah.
It's essential. And what happens is when you have a dissonance when the cause does not equal the effect, right? Somebody pinches somebody and the other person starts screaming and crying and falling on the ground, right? Um, so that dissonance kicks you out of the moment.
Yep.
Now, that kicking out of the moment we talked about earlier, we call a distancing or an alienating effect, right? In epic theater, it's called the Verfremdung effect, right? And it's the moment where the brain goes, "What or why? What just happened? Why did this happen?" And now you're intellectualizing the moment, so you're no longer in the flow of the story. You're
Yep.
outside of it, having a meta conversation with yourself about the story. That creates a separation between you and the empathic moment,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Because now you're in an intellectualization of the moment. So I think that our two fields are using two different terms
Yeah.
to really describe the same thing, which is you need to have a domino experience in order for the flow to continue happening. And logic and cause and effect are a part of that.
And
And when we were talking about the Star Trek effect,
yes.
that tells the brain, oh, when this happens, the effect is I am moving 1,000 miles, right? And so that is part of the cause effect inside of our story.
Yes. And JJ, so on the from the educational academic side, right, interactivities that drive interactivity with flow theory, and you're hitting on it. I think Dr. Hofstadter, this is perfect. The one that JJ just mentioned with the Star Trek thing, this is called learner to interface, right? So the learner to interface, right, drives the interactivity of flow within the students. And JJ's example right there is perfect, right? The ability for the learner to kind of interact with the immersive technology or what the immersive technology is actually doing. That's one. In your question, it would be called learner to content or learner to context, right? For the ability for the learner to connect or connect the context or the cause and effect, right, to the environment that they're in, right? Or for you, the story, the narrative, right? And so if they can't make the connection, right, the ability to apply that connection, right, then you're missing a factor that can drive to flow theory, right? One of the interactivities. So it's the interface, the learner to content or context, if you will. And then there's others that are outside that environment, like learner to learner and like learner to instructor, right? But those are outside of the context of an immersive environment. Or what you're asking for is about how story looks, or in this case, as you're talking about this cause and effect thing that JJ's talking about. Yep.
And
Yeah,
Aaron,
but let me ask you
I'm gonna.
something.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, let me ask you something about cause and effect. Uh, Grossly conceived, we can talk about two different methodologies in history. One is narrative history. The other is less convenient naming, but let's say argument. An argument is the postulation of a thesis. And then the development of an argument based on evidence, logically ordered, much like say, a lawyer might order the questions asked of a witness to put evidence in a positive context. And I think talking about cause and effect is more in the field of argument to develop a thesis about how something happens and then organize evidence in support of that. And that is the method, the genius of 90% of historical writing over 150 years of professional historical writing in history in universities. Narrative writing in history is often put aside as a kind of popularization of history. But my argument with my students is that narrative really is one of the most powerful tools that a historian has, because it can convince without having to present an argument. In other words, and this is a conversation I have with a colleague with whom I'm in a long form project, writing a book, and whom I'm trying to get to conceive the project in form of a narrative, because in developing a narrative as a sequence of contingent events, my colleague constantly wants to stop and explain what's happening. So when you were talking about flow, JJ, and the airplane taking off, and then there are the term you used were intellectual disruptions, is a breaking of this sequence of contingent events into an explanation of why they're happening. Is that what you meant by? I mean, is that an intellectual disruption?
It is in a written form, right? Right.
Yeah, and
And
I'm talking
so,
about written form here.
it's like there's a writer called Neil Stevenson who's really brilliant, but he, to me, overwrites so technically that I get lost.
Mm.
Sometimes I actually have to find myself scanning his books just to maintain a narrative flow of the experience, and then I'm building my own story out of his, really, because he's so detailed. And Andy, you want to talk about building your own story?
Yeah. So as I hear this conversation unfolding, another term that comes to me, or if I add a word onto the back end of narrative, and we use this at LDC, is called narrative psychology, right? And so if we just, a small definition of that is narrative psychology is creating meaning and value from our experiences. So let's change that definition just a little bit, creating meaning and value from our stories or from history, right? And and I think Dr. Hofstad, with your colleague who may be trying to write more, I'll say more technical, and that's probably not the right word, versus writing a narrative about history, or from meaning and value of the experience or of the history versus the technical-ish, which is what you kind of talked about at the very beginning, right? And that's the same thing that can happen in immersive learning, right? Or like JJ just mentioned with that other author. He was so technical in his writing that JJ's trying to scan through it, maybe at a more broader view, to find the meaning and value, right? Right, from this experience of reading this book, or if it's from history or wherever it may be. So that's another way when I look at narrative, right? It's people who create meaning and value from their thoughts, from the experience, from history, from the story, from the experience they have in VR, right? So we call it narrative psychology, right? And so music is narrative psychology, creating meaning and value from the story that music tells you. Because when you listen to the same song that I listen to, we both will probably say something different about it. We'll give you a different narrative because my meaning and value from that song will be different than yours. And I see that might happen probably in history, right, and stuff, or how in an immersive learning design, what is the meaning and value of the experience I'm trying to give them through the story that I'm driving through the immersive experience, right? And so that's how when I'm thinking of
Yeah.
narrative.
What's interesting about that is that with musical theater, the musical itself is trying to tell the audience, the music itself is telling the audience what to feel, right? Valjean, at last we see each other plain, Monsieur le Maire. You wear a different chain. I have a castle on a cloud. Welcome, Monsieur, sit yourself down, right? It tells you how to feel in that moment, right? And then if I say, he's acting jolly because he wants you to feel happy, that that moment is broken, right? A new moment is there.
Is that
Um,
the fourth wall, JJ?
well, right now, Warren, as I look directly at you, I'm breaking the fourth wall.
Right.
But if I talk to my invisible friend Charlie over there, there's a fourth wall. So that's the simplicity. I wonder, Aaron, if you have any thoughts that you want to inject into our conversation.
Well, sorry first of all for making all that noise earlier. I forgot to turn my microphone on. Can you guys hear me okay now?
Yeah, but
I,
we weren't disturbed. You didn't disturb.
Oh, okay. So one of the things I thought, just from recent pop culture, I don't know if you guys have been following the sort of renewed interest, I think, in South Park, the show South Park,
Yeah.
as a sort of social commentary.
Yeah.
And there was this video that the guys who created that, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, I guess, I think are their names. The guys who created that show did a talk in public about a year ago where they talked about narrative design and how their approach, which sounds very trite when you put it this way, but I could see easily how this method has allowed them to be uh such prolific creators, because they are, right? There's like a brand new episode of South Park every single week for what, like the last 19 years or something like that. And so there's this improv method, right? It's the yes and method. And I don't know if this actually also resonates with Warren. You know, there's a way of presenting information that is just sequencing things. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And Matt Stone and Trey Parker say their approach to this goes something like this. It's It's but or it's therefore. Never and. This thing happened, but that thing happened, therefore this thing happened. And now all of a sudden you've got this connective tissue that takes a dull recitation of a historical series of events, and it creates the narrative structure. You may still just be telling the same story, but the energy that you put into it to create those causal relationships between the things with but creates tension. This thing happened, but that thing happened, and then therefore is the glue that puts it together. And then, of course, the rest. Go ahead, JJ, please.
I was just going to say it's interesting because, and this is controversial, but amongst nerds, but I think it's the flaw of the second movie in the Lord of the Rings is that they're just walking, right? Right? They're doing
Talk about a
this
dull series
and
of
then
events.
this
Yeah.
and then this, and then this.
Yes.
Yeah. And I
Meaning
think
they're
there's
just walking and one thing happens and then something else happens and then something else happens, but you don't get the connective tissue.
Well, yeah, they don't turn left because something happens. They know where they're going the whole time, right? And they've got a journey to go through and it's preset, and so it's just and then and then and then.
That
Um,
might, and I think that may be a little bit where maybe sometimes, and coming from someone who's not a historian and stuff like that, but maybe how history is usually maybe talked about.
yeah,
Right, and Aaron, I love this but and therefore, because in LDC we do the improv thing. JJ's done it with us, yes, and with our instructors to get them used to sitting to be able to sit in the moment, right? As part of improv, sitting in the moment, especially with our students, whatever they bring to us, whatever they say, right? Yes, and to be able to continue that conversation with them. However, right, I think there's some interesting thing here, but because it creates tension, and then what my brain goes to is in immersive design, right? And this, if we go back to like the airmen on the moon base with in the biosphere thing, how do you create tension to make them have to have conversations to practice those things in an immersive space that I'm not doing in my physical leadership reaction course? So when you talk to a designer and developer, well, we got to figure this out, right? What are these design elements? Literally, what you just said is literally a design element, the but. So how do you bring in the but into the storyline that these, like, say, four airmen that are in this VR experience that are on a moon base on the moon, right, in the biosphere, and there's an asteroid coming, and you got contested objectives and contested resources. What's another design element of the storyline? The word but, right? How do you bring that storyline of but into this that requires these 4 or 5 airmen in VR to have to work together, communicate with each other? Because if I do it goes back to that victory by design. It's going to be and to the end of the task. And in our case, I don't want there to be end tasks, to be honest. I want there to be these buts and therefores, right? And it keeps them in this ambiguous tension, which is what I need. It's a stress thing. Going back to JJ's thing about stress and General Robinson saying physical stress. I'm like, sir, there's so many ways that we don't need physical stress and not everybody can do physical stress. And not everybody in the Air Force can even do those leadership reaction courses because they're either broke on profile or whatever, all kinds of things. But with the VR thing, right, we strip away the fact that everybody has access to this and everybody can actually go do it. And I provide these other design elements and this thing of but to bring intention into the storyline of an immersive experience, so people can actually navigate human domain conversations, which is the practice of all of our categories of leadership competencies. Like, just hit me in the head with a light bulb, because all I've ever done for the last 6 years is yes and, because I've been teaching instructors in a classroom how to continue open conversations about topics. But now when I talk about an immersive experience and I need them to be feeling ambiguity and tension and stuff, it's not yes and for a designer. It's got to be a but into the storyline.
So, I've told you about Jeff Worth and the new book that he has out. You should get it because in his improvisation, but is very important, right? That yes and can be a negative. It doesn't always have to be a positive. And that negative can be very important to story, especially when it's teaching, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here's what the but represents. I have a story. I am on a normal world progression. I have established that world. I have expectations. The but interrupts my expectations, and introduces surprise,
Taking notes.
right? That surprise moment forces you to make a momentary decision, right? And it doesn't require conflict until you're being asked to assume a different story that's in conflict with your initial one,
Yes.
right? So we know, if we look at those two truths, we know we can manufacture an initial story, and then we can interrupt it, and in that interruption generate an honest response.
And that goes back to your example, JJ, with the teams that you were talking about, where they're just bubbling things in and stuff like that, and trying to cram out, like that probably was not set and designed that way, right? And
No, man. Dude, those ABCDs, that's in the real life of going through anything. If you're better off saying, what are you going to do? I'm going to grab my Rolodex and call Charlie. Great. Grab your Rolodex and call Charlie. I don't even care if Charlie's on the other side of the room or in the room next door. Hold that conversation. I want to hear what you're going to say, right? And what do they know that Charlie doesn't know? What does Charlie need to know? And then at the end of the conversation, did they actually succeed, or did they mess each other up because they only gave each other half the information, right?
Yep. Yes.
So, Andy, let me ask you a question. I think the context of story that we've been discussing is story with undetermined outcome. And of course, the military, looking into the future, is an exercise in undetermined outcomes. And your story about airmen on a moon base facing a crisis is an undetermined outcome. But in history, we know the outcome.
Yes.
And story then becomes a powerful tool of explaining that outcome. But how, and this is something I wrestle with, how to create that sense of indeterminacy,
Yes.
which is a formula for excitement
Mhm.
and engagement and history. And in the example, and I won't go over it because it's at least an hour lecture, but on Reconstruction and the sequence of events that took place after the American Civil War from 1865 really to 1870 or maybe 1877. But I have, in presenting that to students for over many years, I've presented it as a story, but it's a story tradition. I mean, a while back, I would just lecture, I would tell this story
Mhm.
and hopefully engage students in the connectedness of events. But that old adage of tell me something and I will forget, engage me and I will I may remember, but involve me and I will learn. Um, how can I create that sense of contingency or indeterminacy
Mhm.
among students to recapture the anxiety, the tensions,
Yes.
the possibilities, the fears of a really profound turning point in American history?
Dr. Harshal, you sit right where 85% of the professors at Air University are historians and political scientists, or poli-sci historians, professors, and 90% of the curriculum at Air University is rooted in history, teaching history, air power, history of political science, history of political conflicts. And I've been through ACSC, and I've seen the students when they get day one and they take a picture of like 5 stacks of books that are 5 feet tall. These are all the history books you're going to read over the next 10 months, right, to get your master's in military operational art and science at Air Command Staff College and Air War College. I went through ACSC. I went through it. Struggled because I'm not a history person. I can't read that way. And ever since I graduated from there and now the faculty at Air University, I've been trying to talk to all the professors and stuff like that. How do we make history immersive, right? How do we put them into, right, the Bay of Pigs, right? Or right when they made the decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima, right? And so and the connection between these events and dates and times we started with trying to describe to them like maybe we could capture these things in 360. There's tons of things out there. There's right. So how do I put them into immersive spaces? I'll give a quick example. In the Engage platform, there used to be a B-29 bomber aircraft that you could go in, and it's flying over World War II. It's all digitally built and stuff like that. The only thing that's real in it, the audio in it is real because the audio came from a BBC reporter that was on that plane back in the old days and talking about the flight, and it was an 8-hour flight over Germany in World War II, and it's the BBC reporter talking. It's that that old JJ could do better accent of like a reporter back then, a British reporter back on the BBC
What
radio.
time you have,
Exactly.
fly
He was in that real plane, but they took that audio and built the immersive experience around it. So I'm in that B-29 looking down at the bomber thing, right? And they're talking about the two pilots that are 19 years old, the bomber's 21 years old, and the BBC reporter's talking about, and we are now 200 miles away from Berlin Air, and we're, and now they're getting the bomb bay doors open, and right, but that's that audio is real. And I'm sitting there like, this is like, and I'm thinking, they're 19-year-old airmen. This is what our Air Force was during World War II. But it was the experience, but it was that real audio, right? So I think there's ways to do it. We have to find those immersive design elements, story, audio, right? Those types of things that you take these recordings that we have tons of, and you can virtualize it. That might be a way to like take these audio recordings of history and virtualize it. I don't know if that's the right term, but I've been trying to get Area University to understand like we have got to move out of this, and it's fine for us to read these history books, but the students are not connecting, right? And these are people that already have master's degrees. These are lieutenant colonels in the Air Force. They have multiple degrees. They're extremely smart. They're the top 10% of the people in the Air Force. And they come here and it's like they're going through it because the people that run the college departments are all historians. And so this is how we've been taught. This is how I taught. This is how I got my degree. So I'm going to teach how I teach history and political science to military members. I'm like, we got to put them in an immersive space and make them connect with it so that it makes more sense to them. And so I've been asking and trying to figure out how do we do that, and also get all the historians and professors to move away from this lecture base. They usually lecture on stage for an hour. The students go into a classroom and have an adjunct instructor, and they talk about some historical event that they had to read about with the lecture that they just got from the head professor, and go in a classroom for an hour and talk about it, when really it's the adjunct instructor basically regurgitating the history of the book and the lecture from the professor.
Right.
I'm like, we've got to put them in something. They've got to get into this.
Well, that's the question behind this whole discussion, isn't it? How can we create immersive experiences that energize the contingency of events and the uncertainty of outcomes?
Yes.
So Warren, you and I have created the great experiment, right? Where you can stand in Independence Hall, watch the debate, you can talk with one of the founders and hear their point of view. You can step into their shoes and redebate the Constitution, right? Now, where I think we fail in what you're talking about is I think our monologues are more informative than empathic, right? So if we really wanted to create what you were talking about, we would start with a different relational moment so that you cared more, either about the debate or about the individual's perspective. But Andy, there's at a Butler College or university, there's a format of taking your class and making an immersive history moment, and then asking your students to step into those characters, and they each have 3 objectives, and you've got 2 hours of improvisation or whatever to accomplish those objectives. I've lived through those kinds of immersive learning historical experiences, and they are profound. Here's the question first. So Warren, that's one place, and I know that Kevin was doing some of that. The question is, how do we put it into immersion and make it easier, right? Because organizing the whole thing live is a huge task, right? And then, so another question is, if the great experiment is possible, can we get that used by students at Air University?
So, yes. I actually, last year,
that'd be great.
so not the great, so we did we downloaded the Great Experiment, the light version, because I'm able to access. I know I could actually do the request for the full, but I just had my students do the light, and they actually had them do it. They had to write a comparative analysis of how was that experience immersive, or why was that experience immersive. And then they actually used the immersive experience taxonomy that JJ and Dr. Obey actually developed. and they have to use that as the framework for the analysis of, right? So they're looking at, right, an historical thing, what made it immersive, by using the framework that JJ and they came up with. So we've been doing that, and so we're actually getting right. That next assignment for the new class that just started is in like September, and so they'll, over the next couple weeks, they'll be tasked to do that, and then they will talk through what made it immersive and what was made it connected for you and stuff like that, and they have to kind of dissect it through the taxonomy. So that's kind of what. So JJ, I think maybe there's more we could probably kind of do, and the only thing I know that's kind of moving maybe some of this forward is probably, and JJ and Aaron maybe could jump in, may know more probably than I do, is the AI agents that you're seeing in VR. I know like there's platforms out there that now you can go talk to historical figures in these AI VR environments and stuff like that. And so I think they're still very immature, right? Because just going there and staying there and talking to Albert Einstein, I think there's got to be more than just going there and like, seeing an avatar of Albert Einstein in VR and just standing there and talking to it. I think there needs to be more story or immersion to it, and the connection with like history or something, or like you're literally like you're in there like working, building, the electric light bulb or something like that with Albert Einstein and talking, versus just standing there because that's what we're doing right now, because that's what the AI and people have built. Hey, you can go into my VR environment from our company because we have an AI agent in it, and we've created Albert Einstein, we've created, whatever figure, and those are our two that we have. You can go in there and do that, and you're just going to ask it questions and it's going to respond. Because, right, and Aaron, we can make these pretty simple, and then you just push it into a VR space. There's got to be more of a storyline to make that connection that you're talking about, the cause and effect, right, between historical moments that we haven't done yet. We're just on the surface of these VR AI historical agents, if you will, that we're starting to see in these VR environments. They're just still immature.
Well, unless you get the participant active, they are not in the flow.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
They're simply a listener.
Yeah. If you're there doing something with Albert Einstein in the flow, and there's a story, and you're right, you're working on a project, you're inventing something, or you're inventing the bicycle, right, or whatever it is, or right, for history, you're sitting and you're talking with JFK, right, about the Bay of Pigs, and like, are we gonna like invade in Cuba? Are we gonna, right, or are we just gonna make the blockade? And thank God we did the blockade, because if we invaded, there probably would have been nuclear missiles shot at us from Cuba, and right, kind of thing. So right, versus just going into VR and, oh, we have an avatar of JFK, ask it a question, right, kind of thing. That's not immersive. Yep.
Aaron, you have a thought?
We're close to the end, JJ. You want to give me that time? I think that I'm so frustrated by how long it is taking me to get to actually playing with these problems, right? Because I agree with Andy. A lot of what I've seen in this space is, I've given this chatbot a backstory, and now it's a chatbot and you talk to it, right? Like, and I think JJ, you and I have talked with other entrepreneurs who played with these things. And I think that in systems like Convey, however you want to pronounce that, you have the introduction of something called statefulness. And statefulness is the difference between a chatbot that has a one-dimensional personality and backstory, and a thing that has different waypoints, different narrative elements that have been strung together in a causal way. So you start with state one. Let's just take the Albert Einstein example. State one is usually get to know you, right? And if we reach for what JJ has always coached me on, there's got to be something that hooks the user in. And whatever it is that Einstein's going to do in that moment that is themed to Einstein and loosely constrained by his backstory has got to hook that user, and how they respond to that. At some point, the bot has to go, now I know what I'm dealing with. I'm informed by who this is. I'm going to take that variable forward. And now we're going to talk about that eureka moment that I had where E equals MC squared. And so it's that statefulness that's currently missing, I think. And there's probably a little bit, I'm really taking a liberty here, Warren, but I think that, you know, there's probably a way of thinking about these things right now where there's so much emphasis and importance placed on the accuracy of the thing that is coming out of this machine, that there's not enough room to play with the statefulness of it, because it's not going to work, right? Like when you look at the percentages that even ChatGPT 5 released last week, they benchmark these things and they get real proud of themselves. Hey, 70% of the time it passes this test. And you're like, well, what about the other 30% of the time where it doesn't, right? And it's like, yeah, it probably makes mistakes, but for the 70% of the time, it can be ridiculously engaging and personalize that information to the user. And I just think that's the area of play. And again, a tool like Convi has this built into it. It's not as easy as just dropping it into a VR thing and playing with it. And I'm not speaking from experience. I logged in, I looked at the feature, understood what they were going for. You have to think like you're creating a game. And this is the tool that they're giving you, but it backs up into an LLM that can actually come up with a halfway decent response to whatever you say, no matter what you say. And so it's really, it's a wide open field for experimentation. You just got to be willing to play with it and let it make some mistakes, while those real geniuses work on getting that accuracy up to 100%. That's not our job. Our job is to make it fun and engaging and do cool stuff with it.
Well, let me thank you all for being here at, once again, one of our community lunches. Dr. Clayton, thank you again for sharing your knowledge and insight with us, and being a part of our community here. And we wish everyone a great week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, JJ. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Warren. Thanks, Aaron.
See you soon.
Thanks, Luke.